Once upon a time there was a young boy, on the cusp of adulthood but still a child, homesick and bored. His mother came to him, but she didn't bring a grandfather with a book of fairy tales, and instead offered to go to the video store and rent that young boy a film. He likely asked for some super cool action flick, whatever the latest zeitgeist-capturing big-budget blockbuster was. But he was left disappointed, as she returned with something else. Something that young boy wasn't happy with. He took one look at that cover and assumed it would be a boring fantasy, a film that could only entertain a child, full of men prancing about in tights and children who would sell their soul for Turkish delight. And have you tasted Turkish delight? It's disgusting. But he was bored, and he gave it a chance. And that is how I first saw The Princess Bride. It came to be a film I watched every time I was sick, then a film I watched whenever I felt down, and then a film I watched because I just wanted to watch The Princess Bride again. The film didn't do especially well on release, a $30 million box office on a $15 million budget, making it a small success. And the film itself knows exactly why. How do you convince a kid Fred Savage's age in 1987 that this is a film he wants to see? Kids in 1987 wanted to see RoboCop or Beverly Hills Cop 2, but they would settle for The Living Daylights. Action cinema had changed, more overtly targeting younger audiences who saw themselves as more mature, and would perhaps prefer to sneak into films that may not have been intended for them, but were marketed as if they were. Family cinema had changed too, particularly in the wake of Star Wars, and the biggest family films of 1987 had a sci-fi bent, Batteries Not Included and Inner Space, with another now fondly remembered film from the previous year, Jim Henson's Glorious Labyrinth, being a major box office bomb in the States, particularly contrasted to the massive success of The Karate Kid Part 2, a film that was just the action film formula sanded down into child-friendly fare. This was coupled with the trifecta of children's entertainment in the 80s, games consoles, TVs and toys, often indelibly linked as what was cool cross-pollinated across the three mediums, each reinforcing what a young man's idea of desirable entertainment should be. And in that context, The Princess Bride looked like a film that your old man was watching on TCM, while you screamed at him that it was boring and that he should change the channel to something more hip, cool, or now. The Princess Bride was self-aware enough to understand that it wouldn't be desirable, and yet, over time, like the story told from grandfather to grandson, its following grew, charming audience after audience until today it stands indisputably a classic. With its star, Cary Elwes, writing a best-selling memoir focused entirely on his experiences while making the film. And I don't care how much money they grossed, he's not writing books about hotshots, Twister, or men in tights, is he? I actually own a copy of that book, and to give you an idea of how much I've read about The Princess Bride over the years, there was not one story in his collection of never-told-before anecdotes that I had not heard somewhere before. Well, there was one, Elwes talking about how Andre the Giant regaled him with tales of his exploits on set. That reads suspiciously like just copying the eighth wonder of the world's Wikipedia article into a Word doc, and claiming Andre said it. But I'm not here to shame. I love the book, Cary. Do one on The Crush next. So, forewarned for what's about to happen. I'm about to criticize The Princess Bride.
What?
But don't worry, I'm going to go on to say that its imperfections actually improve the film.
I'm explaining to you because you look nervous.
There are little things pretty early on, like how the matte painting of the Cliffs of Insanity doesn't look like the Cliffs of Insanity they are climbing, or that Andre is clearly going at a much faster clip in the long shots than in the close-ups. And don't get me started on how this clearly isn't Andre the Giant riding a horse, probably because there is not a horse alive that could do that and remain, well, alive. Or the hokiness of the rodents of unusual size, or the shrieking eels. Special effects that may look somewhat laughable today, and, it shouldn't be forgotten, looked somewhat laughable at the time too, comparing unfavourably with the Henson Workshop slickness of Labyrinth or 1982's Dark Crystal, or the groundbreaking work of Lucas's ILM during that decade. But these faults give the film the feel of classic cinema, not so much failures as throwback messiness. Practical creature effects that bring to mind early pioneers like 1940's The Thief of Baghdad. Cast interiors lifted straight from 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood. Or painted backdrops recalling 1952's The Prisoner of Zenda. The Princess Bride signalling its lineage. A long line of swashbuckling fantasy. And I'll add to that some of the music, not so much Mark Knopfler's understated and melodic guitar work that has rightly become iconic, although it could be argued that this is definitely low-key by the standards of soundtracks in the 80s. Thanks, John Williams, you ruined it for everyone, I hope you're happy. But more the rather tacky-sounding synths that honestly aren't a million miles from Chuck Serino's gloriously cheap and cheerful work on the same year's Deathstalker 2. If you take some of these synth stings and swells out of context, they honestly sound laughable.
I'm not left-handed either. Give us the gate key.
But this is the soundtrack. It isn't a joke. This is the vibe they went for, and by the time you're used to it, by the time its little motifs start to shine through, like the plodding but jaunty theme that accompanies Andre the Giant's plodding but jaunty Fezzik, it ceases being jarringly cheesy, and instead becomes a strength. The music, like the whole production, is of its time and also timeless, unmistakably reflecting the decade it was made, but by eschewing the more bombastic and spectacular conventions of its contemporaries, in favour of an understated and lo-fi aesthetic, giving the feeling that it could have appeared there in a time capsule. If you want to get really meta about it, and I occasionally do, I could point to the fact that the entire film is how a 10-year-old boy in 1987 is imagining the story he is being told looks and sounds. And that would be an approximation of swashbuckling cinema, half-remembered from half-watched classics on a television in the corner of the room, and filtered through the prism of the MTV generation. By focusing on these faults, I think it gives you a feeling for why The Princess Bride hasn't aged in the near 40 years since its release. It arrived as a film out of time, weathered and aged like an old book, tattered pages loosen its creased spine, a long-forgotten swashbuckling classic from a fantasy Netherland that never existed. And this is perhaps a rather clever trick in its adaptation, based as it is on William Goldman's 1973 novel of the same name. And if you love this film, you absolutely owe it to yourself to read that book, because no matter how good you think it will be, it is better. The novel similarly functions as a piece of fiction that exists out of time, Goldman using the framing device of abridging a rather unwieldy novel, S. Morgenstern's The Princess Bride, rather cutely titling his release the Good Parts version, to reflect how his father had omitted the more boring and difficult aspects when reading it to him as a child. Now, some have called The Princess Bride, the film, a satire, and I'm going to argue that it isn't. But the novel absolutely is. All of the constituent parts are there, the wonderful characterization, Goldman's typically zippy and often hilarious dialogue, much of which made it straight into the film with barely an apostrophe changed. But it uses all of the classic tropes and cliches to make a rather cynical point about the failures of fantasy fiction. His love for his creation is obviously completely earnest. While based on stock tropes, Goldman has frequently said these are his favourites of all the characters he has written, but they exist inside a skewering of the form that inspired them. But the film doesn't do this for two reasons, one narrative and one regarding who was doing the adaptation, because this isn't simply William Goldman's The Princess Bride, it is Rob Reiner's. Reiner reshapes Goldman's brilliant satire into a love letter to the genre, into an ode to classic cinema that he loved as a child, a square-eyed film geek whose whole life was the entertainment industry. The characters, the plot, the dialogue, that's all Goldman, but it's distilled through the glorious optimism and joy of Reiner, birthing a mythical hydra. One head the dazzling skill and intellect of a brilliant writer interrogating his inspirations, the other the heart and soul of a film nerd flipping the script, playfully sanding off the harder edges to create a magic pill that slips right down. And narratively, this makes sense, because where the novel is Goldman rediscovering this work he loved as a child, and wrestling with the chasm between his nostalgic memories and the reality of what the text says to him as an adult, the film is the story told by the grandfather to the young boy. It's just the good parts. It's a film that is self-aware about its story, about its tropes, about its audience. But it isn't satire. Satire is criticism through humour, and The Princess Bride is completely earnest in what it's doing. It has no problem using fantasy tropes, or even tropes of bad storytelling like exposition dumps.
But I've got my country's 500th anniversary to plan, my wedding to arrange, my wife to murder, and Gilda to frame for it. I'm swamped.
But it genuinely is a campy swashbuckling fantasy. What its self-awareness allows is a complete cutting of any chaff, It's as slick and slender as Elwes' Man in Black traversing the cliffs of insanity, moving from impeccably constructed scene to impeccably constructed scene with as little fuss as possible. If that requires a character delivering exposition and leaving, or having picked up a much-needed item off camera, or a major reveal hinging on someone inexplicably falling on the right knot in a tree, so be it. Where contrivance or coincidence are needed to push the plot forward, they happen, no questions asked. This is The Covenant of the Princess Bride, the deal forged with its audience. A film that shows you its imperfections up front, and asks nothing more of you than to give it a chance. A film that knows you are as aware of the tropes and mores of the genre as its makers, and uses that covenant with the viewer to tell you that it's skipping straight to the good parts. It is genuinely funny.
You fell victim to one of the classic blunders. The most famous is never get involved in a land war in Asia.
It is genuinely powerful.
I want my father back, you son of a bitch.
It is genuinely a loving homage to swashbuckling and fantasy cinema. It is genuinely a film about true love. It is a film made with precisely zero condescension, precisely zero snark or sneering at the genre and its tropes, and instead, 100% love. Love for the genre, love for the audience, and love for the film they were making. Not a satire, but a celebration. All the best parts, not just of the story, but the genre, concentrated into a nostalgic marshmallow gently roasting over a campfire. The most dashing leading man, a career best Cary Elwes, effortlessly channeling Douglas Fairbanks, Errol Flynn, and Stuart Granger. The most beautiful princess, the brilliant Robin Wright, powerfully earnest in a way that never cloys or jars. The most dastardly villain, the most cruel-hearted henchman, the biggest giant, the greatest revenge story, the truest love. It is a film that secret lies in being genuinely, absolutely genuinely without one hint of contempt or disdain. Lovely.
It's you.
But that doesn't mean it isn't funny. The Princess Bride is primarily a comedy, or at least a light-hearted romp that keeps comedy as an arrow in its quiver, never far from being fired. In this way, perhaps you could say it recalls classic Disney adaptations like the 1973 version of Robin Hood, and some of its comedy is cartoonish. But comedic relief, particularly in supporting characters who pop up to deliver shtick, was a fixture of swashbuckling fantasy too. And here we have the vaudeville vim and vinegar of Billy Crystal and Carol Kane, as well as fun cameos from unsung British comedic greats like Peter Cook.
Knowledge.
And the late great Mel Smith, who many will not be aware of as he sadly never really escaped television's sketch comedy for more substantial roles. A real shame, as he was honestly one of the finest British comedy talents of his generation.
Don't even think. Don't even think about trying to escape.
And this high-wire tightrope act, acrobatically flipping from tension to comedy, earnestness to silliness, often from moment to moment and then back again, is pulled off flawlessly. A three-ring circus with something for everyone that moves so fast it never skips a beat. While the film has a real pace to it, whipping its narrative along with as little ado or dally as possible, the scenes themselves are given time, room to breathe. Reiner's camera never the star, but the star maker, with long unbroken takes and unfussy editing that highlight Goldman's crackling and precise dialogue, or, say, the sublime skill of Patinkin and Elwes in delivering the single greatest sword fight in cinema history. And I will fight you while telling you what techniques I'm using if you disagree. These long takes also allow an eclectic but exceptional cast, every performer inhabiting a character they were seemingly tailored to play, space to express themselves in what are, on paper, relatively small or slight roles. For example, Wallace Shawn is in a grand total of 5 scenes, and only has a substantial amount of lines in one, gone from the film around the half-hour mark. And yet, his Vicini is perfectly formed. A performance and character so memorable that I guarantee someone has quoted that line to you at least once, and you've replied in the only way that is possible.
Inconceivable! You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Even Inigo and Fezzik are in the film surprisingly little, after being bested in the iconic sword fight that is effectively the film's first big set piece. The fiery Spanish swordsman hell-bent on revenge vanishes from the screen for nearly 40 minutes, before reappearing drunk and dishevelled, a broken man for whom the only certainties in his life, that he is the world's greatest swordsman and he will have his revenge, lay in tatters before him. We don't need to be told how he got there, we know. The weight of the journey and the reasons for his condition are apparent, and that is a perfect example of how there isn't a wasted moment in the film. That the storytelling and character building are not just peerless, but economical. To again take Inigo as an example, every line and interaction, while entertaining in their own right, are in service to building his character. We are shown his bond with Fezzik. We are explicitly told he is a drunk as he is insulted by Bassini, which in turn tells us that Bassini is an abusive and belittling employer. We see that he is a man of honor, and in his grand and beautifully delivered speech we learn that his sole purpose in what remains of his tattered life is vengeance for the death of his father. And then he is gone as we whiz on to the next grand adventure and the next and the next. A breathless cavalcade of fantasy daring do, all breezing into each other. But when he reappears in the film, it is like seeing an old friend. Inigo is at once a classic archetype of fantasy fiction, but also distinct. A fantastic performance from Mandy Patinkin making flesh for Goldman's phenomenal characterization. And you could do this for every character, recognizable archetypes in so much as that allows a viewer to fill in the blanks, but with a distinctness that comes from a perfect marriage of performer and Goldman's flair and precision. The archetypes serve not as satire, but as a prefabricated foundation upon which Goldman and Reiner build grand cathedrals of characterization, rising above their inspiration, reflecting a film that does the same, a fantasy greatest hits album that never stops delivering classic moments. The Princess Bride is at once recognizable and completely unique. It's the feeling of being a child on a rainy Sunday afternoon in front of the television with your entire family, distilled into a perfect confection. Sweet but not smaltzy. Ah hell, who am I kidding? It's got the most smaltzy ending of all time and it pulls it off twice over. The Princess Bride is a film that tells you it's okay to be a kid again sometimes. That we can lose ourselves in a simple story. That we don't need to be cynical, pick holes, or have everything delivered to us with a knowing layer of irony. That the good guys can win, that justice can be served, that nothing, not even death, can stand in the way of true love. And that people can know exactly what you mean, even if you're too cool to actually say it.
Maybe you could come over and read it again to me tomorrow.
As you wish.
It's not a satire of fairy tales or happy ever afters. It's a celebration of their power in bringing people together. It's a warm hug that tells you everything is going to be okay. And sometimes, that's exactly what we all need. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate listening to this as it means you've made it all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this and don't already subscribe, feel free to like and subscribe and all that nice stuff, and maybe check out some of my other videos, which are generally on films I like, and hopefully you'll enjoy those too. If you think others may enjoy this video, don't be scared to share it with friends or family, or even enemies who you seek vengeance on. And similarly, if you know people who haven't seen The Princess Bride, make it your mission to ensure that is rectified. If you have any feedback, good or bad, both are great. Don't be scared to comment below, and I may not get back to you right away, but I generally do eventually. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.